Should I start? Should I not start? All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Chinedum Daniels, and I'm your chief adjudicator for today's prelim rounds of the 2025 FCT Inter-Secondary Schools Debate Competition. And we had a panel of two other individuals, Joan Hart Oko and Divine Abra. They were members of this panel and helped to reach, these results that we're announcing now. So round one have already had their results announced to them, so I don't think there will be any need to go through that again. So we're moving straight to round two. But before I start, a big congratulations to every single team that was involved in today's debate rounds. We saw a lot of amazing talent and a lot of schools with a lot of prospects and wonderful engagement all around. And we hope they continue to be in this sport. We are all winners at the very end of the day. For round two, we had La Vogue School versus Ladella Schools, APO. And the motion was, this house will remove fuel subsidies permanently to stabilize Nigeria's economy. Now, for us on panel, we felt like the burden was pretty simple on both sides. One was to prove what stability looked like for a Nigerian economy. Two was to consider comfort versus finite resources. And lastly, whether it made sense for a government to spend so much on consumption versus reprioritizing that spending on things like investment. And we felt like on both sides of the house, the engagements were wonderful, but at the very end of the day, there had to be a winner. But before I go into the core justification, the team that succeeded in convincing us and ended up winners of this particular round were the team from side proposition La Vogue School. And here's the justification, right? On the idea of what stability looked like, we felt like the argumentation was simple from side proposition. One is that they agreed that fuel subsidies existence removes what as economic stability, in the sense that one, individuals or the government or individuals existing within that government would not have access to a lot of amenities which is taken away by money that is being spent on fuel subsidy. So they talk about how government is releasing over trillions of naira into trying to subsidize fuel. And they also talk about the direct impact of what that benefit looks like. At the very least, what it means is that you buy fuel at a cheaper rate. At the very least, you are able to fuel your generators more, fuel your cars more often. But then the comparative disadvantage then becomes that education does not get as much when you come down to budgetary. That health does not get as much when you come down to budgetary policies and all of that stuff. We felt like at that very point, the burden on opposition then became to prove to us how that comparative advantage that you get when you are able to subsidize fuel as against when all those other sectors suffer is something that was largely lacking. On that particular clash, we felt like proposition obviously edged out with their level of argumentation that they brought in. Next thing is how they talked about how deregulation has fostered private investment, and we're able to prove that, so how individuals are more likely to come into a system that is deregulated, that has a free market policy, where government does not put a price cap and then just continues to pump money to like cover those prices. Because the argumentation is simple, right? That the prices of fuel necessarily have not changed. It's just that government was paying the deficit or paying the surplus for us, right? And we're able to like survive, that length of period of time. Also, government was able to prove that they are not necessarily going to create a system that is going to be instantaneous, right? The benefits is not going to be instantaneous. So we came down to a short-term, long-term benefit argumentation, right? So where you have subsidy removed now, and people suffer in the interim in the sense that things are more expensive. And then in the long run, you're able to have more money to be able to finance other sectors. Then you're even able to like provide alternative sources of income through investing in agriculture and the rest of that. I felt like those conversations were things that edge proposition at the very end of the day, right? Lastly, and most importantly, is how they spoke about the fiscal burden that it places on government, and how social unrest does not necessarily mean that the the economy necessarily is not stabilizing, right? That individuals are being restless because one, things are now more expensive than they used to be, does not necessarily translate to an economic, failure of the state in and of itself. Because then the expense is an expense that has always been paid for. The problem is who has been paying for it, right? And at the very end of the day, they were able to, show us how, those disadvantages in and of themselves are merely short term and are things that time will necessarily heal over time. Why does opposition still is unable to win today's case? We felt like the argumentation around how the removal of the art cap will lead to price increases of all consumption products, where they say that, the removal of subsidy is going to make things go up, is going to make prices go up, right? They are unable to, however, prove how all of those unique harms that they create is not something that exists in another, in proposition's world, or in their world rather. So what that necessarily means is that things are still expensive in a world where you have fuel subsidy. Things are still expensive in a world where fuel subsidy does not exist. You still have smuggling, you still have bunkering. So there are no unique, harms, or no unique benefits that they're able to prove to us to show us why subsidy is not something that should be removed in and of itself. However, I felt like this debate was not fully engaged to the scope that it was supposed to be engaged at, because the debate talked about why it should happen permanently, right? So I felt like the idea of its permanence was something that both teams were unable to necessarily address fully. So now, so that means progressing from Group B is Team Lavogue from side proposition. Moving on to round 3, so we can move on quickly. We had we had Team Marvelous on proposition and JC Best on opposition, right? And the motion was, this House supports the creation of special courts for the handling of corruption cases in Nigeria, right? And in this debate, we had Marvelous on proposition and JC Best on opposition, sorry. And the winner for this debate was JC Best, right, on opposition. And it's simple. We felt like the argumentation, the burden on the debate was to prove the necessity and the justification for the creation of a new court for a sole purpose, right? Whether it be corruption, be whatever reason it is. But the primary cause is that you're creating a special court, you're creating, the way you have the industrial court, you're creating a separate system with separate judges, with separate buildings, with separate infrastructure. What then becomes the justification, right? On the clash of necessity, proposition's argument is this, right? That they want speed and they want transparency, right? They want a world where people can interrogate and assess these courts better, right? However, they fail to prove how creating a new court will create better transparency. They fail to prove how that ability to have a new building that is specifically for corrupt corrupt cases is necessarily going to make everybody start to checkmate them better, right? Secondly, is that they talk about speed. They talk about how they want things to happen fast. They want cases to be heard fast, right? We don't see how, because the opposition raises an issue of an understaffed judiciary. They don't show how their world where they create a separate, system for these guys necessarily solves that issue of the fact that you will still have a limited number of judges to hear those cases. It means that at the very least, you just have another court that will still face the same bureaucracy problems that necessarily, occur, right? Other things is that they talk about how, court environment is going to be improved. On panel, we felt like that argumentation did not hold water because they were able to prove how the creation of a new court and the change of environment is necessarily going to bring better judgment in and of itself, or translate to better judgment in and of itself, right? However, how opposition is able to win on the idea of necessity and justification is on 3 levels, right? One is that they are able to argue how sorry, give me 1 second. They're able to argue how, one, you risk the erosion of due process when you want to rush justice in and of itself. When you want to speak track justice, you first of all are going to have issues where you're putting pressure on judges to be able to wrap up things quickly, and that's something that's antithetical to just the idea of justice itself. The next thing they speak about is how they want the financial burden rather that this creates promote corruption in and of itself. Secondly, they talked about how it will create a access to that financial aid that necessarily corrupts them. It's the fact that they are already inherently corrupt. So the problem is not the financial aid. It's the fact that these governments in and of themselves lack accountability. There's nobody holding them to account. There's nobody checkmating them. There's no checks and balances that prevent that corruption from happening. So it means then that you cannot then withdraw that foreign aid on the author of, or blame the foreign aid for, things that are committed by individuals in and of itself. Get from financial aid. One, like that argumentation was able to sufficiently respond to what proposition says about how corruption is the biggest problem. Proposition is unable to prove why those benefits are not as impactful as opposition says, and for that reason, we have opposition winning round 4 of the debate. So progressing in that round is Roberto Schools from side opposition in round 4. Moving on, we have in round 5 we had opposition and Cape Verde in opposition education system than public schools, right? And here we agreed that on panel, also on a unanimous decision, that proposition won this debate, right? And what was the biggest case, and what was the biggest clash or issue in contention was quality education versus access, right? We felt like all the rest of the argumentation that they had were either not strong enough or not well articulated, but we were able to sieve out these two comparative conversations, right? So what proposition says is simple, right? That what private schools create for you is a system where you have quality education, regardless of the cost. It means then that they prove it by showing how individuals with means and access, even individuals without means and access, try to put their kids into private schools. They also speak about how private schools are constantly creating competition in the sense that they're always constantly coming out. There are a lot of them around. They give the quantitative argument as to how you have more private schools in certain regions than public schools in and of itself. It means then that even on the argument of access, you are more likely to see a private school around you than a public school. So it means at the very end of the day that individuals are always going to want to pay for good education, right? They're also able to quantify value as regards whether that education that you're getting is quality or not, right? Because they say that when government, because opposition says that when government employs teachers, they're more likely to be good teachers because it's a government employment. We don't get how that mechanization is true, but proposition proves how it's false, because they say that government is less likely to pay better, right? Because government is unlimited funds, right? It means then that teachers in private school have more incentive to be good teachers. It also means that because of image and because of competition, private schools are more likely to do things like employ good teachers and checkmate those teachers to make sure that they are not, doing things like selling in the school or being bad individuals in and of themselves. So we felt like at that point, with all the other argumentations about better facilities, better economic results, the making of good individuals who went to public school or private school, felt like all those are not exclusive, mutually exclusive to any side. You can have a rich a big politician from a private school. You can also have a big person from a public school. It has never really how people turn out has never really been a direct impact of the schools that they've attended in the past. So at the very end of the day, in that particular round, we felt that we believed on panel that side proposition that white pearl were the school progressing to the next round. Next, in round 6, we have Cherryfield on side proposition and Brightark on side opposition. And the motion was this house would make coding and artificial intelligence compulsory subjects in Nigerian schools. And we felt that the conversation and the burden on both houses were pretty simple, right? Why is it a necessity for you to create a new or a novel subject, right, in schools, in Nigerian schools, considering the current Nigerian education climate, right? On panel, we felt like opposition were able to edge out and win that round in this debate. That's Brightark schools, right? So, what was the justification for that, argument? What proposition's case is, look, that individuals need problem-solving skills. Individuals need the promotion of innovation. They want a world where AI will be able to grow those economics and bridge the gaps in the socio-economic, spheres. But however, the argumentation is not sufficient enough to trump what opposition says. Because opposition tells you quite simply, right, that while technology is beneficial, it's not necessary to introduce a system when you've not created a level, a good playing ground for it to thrive in. So what that means is you already have a system where your education is not at its apex level. And the comparative that you're having is with nations like China and nations like United States that have a better system, that have a better government, that have a better education system, which means that them introducing AI makes sense, right? Because then they have the buffers, they have the equipment that already exists, they have the technological know-how in terms of teachers and students and experts around who can train those students properly. Opposition says Nigeria does not have that. We don't have that within our system, and you're only going to fail if you create that kind of introduction. We felt like they were able to prove how it wasn't necessary by showing how Nigeria wasn't ready, and we felt like opposition didn't do enough to prove how, one, Nigeria was ready to accept that, and secondly, how the current system will accommodate the introduction of things like AI, considering introduction of things like AI and coding, considering the absence of knowledge and the absence of technical know-how that exists within that particular system. So that said, that was the end of round 6, and we had Team Bright Arc progressing in that particular round. Now to the last debate, which was a debate between, I believe, Roberto Schools and Short Start Schools and Roberto Schools. Short Start were on proposition and Roberto was on opposition. The motion was, this house supports the regulation of social media to combat misinformation in Nigeria, right? And the debate was pretty straightforward, and we felt like on our side that the winning team was obviously team opposition from Roberto. What were the issues that we had in debate? First was the legitimacy of government's actions, the legitimacy of government to do things like reduce access to free speech, right? First of all, we felt like proposition, had issues with accepting the fact that they were actually going to stifle free speech to an extent. Because what it means is that there has to be guidelines as to what becomes truth, or what becomes, proper information. And the question then becomes, who sets that guideline? Who owns the authority to decide what is truth and what is not truth? And the question then falls back to government. What this necessarily means is simple, and is that, is government a legitimate actor to take such action? We felt like opposition was able to trash that out best, right? Because they're able to prove to you how, one, government, especially the Nigerian government, which is the question of the debate, has a history of constantly stifling truth or stifling, free speech. And with the examples of the NSAS, with the multiple examples of the US, with protests and all of that stuff, right? What they're able to show us in this debate, right, is that you can't say that you're a progressive democratic state and then say that you want to limit how people are able to, give out information under the pretense of being able to show that what is misinformation. Also, they are able to prove that alternatives to decipher misinformation exist through ad blockers, through things like fact checkers and all of those things. We feel like that alternative already solves proposition's problem when they say that you are going to be exposed to ads that are false, or when they say that you're going to be exposed to certain things or certain information that are not true. They explain how, because of the presence of freedom of speech, competing conversations can happen. You can give your own side of the story, another person can give their side of the story. You can tell what you think about COVID, another person can give an opinion on COVID. It means then that because of the existence of that discourse, the conversation about how people will become, will lose themselves to, the conversation that people lose themselves to false information becomes, unnecessary. So that was why that at that point, we felt like opposition obviously trumped over them in that debate. So those are the teams progressing. Roberto, in that particular round. However, to complete this, On panel, we decided we had 2 best losers from 2 different rounds. In the round of White Pearl versus Capeville, we felt like Capeville was one of our best losers and will also be progressing to the out rounds. Also, Cherryfield versus Bright Arc, we felt like that round was also really tight, and Cherryfield would also, regardless of losing, will also be progressing to the next round. Congratulations to all teams and commiserations to the teams that are out of this particular section. Thank you very much. I scored all 8 teams. Okay, so let me just mention all 8 teams so that we don't get mistaken. Cherryfield, Bright Arc, White Pearl, Capeville, Roberto, JC Best, La Vogue. And that's it. Thank you very much. Roberto, I've mentioned it's complete. Thank you very much.